On October 17, 1997, Sheriff Thomas Wilkins received an anonymous tip that would forever change the quiet city of Oak Ridge in the interior of Oregon. The complaint, made by a neighbor who preferred not to identify himself, alleged strange sounds coming from an isolated property belonging to the Blackwood family, established in that mountainous region since the mid-19th century. "There is something wrong in that barn. I have never seen anyone come in or out, but at night sometimes I hear shouts. They are not animals," said the recording of the call preserved in the Lane County Police Archives. What the authorities found on the Blackwood farm, approximately 40 kilometers from Oak Ridge Center, exceeded any expectation. Hidden by dense vegetation and surrounded by a barbed wire fence almost 3 meters high, stood a faded red barn, apparently common from a distance, but sealed with several locks, chains, and padlocks at its only entrance. When the officers broke down the door, the odor was the first thing that hit them, a mixture of urine, feces, and something indefinable that one of the officers would later describe as the smell of the very absence of humanity. Inside, partially illuminated by cracks in the roof, they found 7 women, with ages ranging from 12 to 42 years, living in conditions that the police report classified as incompatible with any standard of human dignity. "I swoon," Dr. Michael Stevenson, a coroner who accompanied the operation, told the Portland Herald. "In 27 years of medicine, I've never seen anything like that. Those women had physical characteristics that immediately suggested severe consanguinity and prolonged familial malformations, extra fingers, obvious vision problems. But the more disturbing feature was the eyes. Everyone had exactly the same empty look." Subsequent investigations would reveal that the barn housed not only victims, but a generational experiment of family endogamy that extended for at least 5 generations. Genetic records collected at the University of Oregon would confirm these were possibly the most consanguineous women ever documented in modern United States history. The property officially belonged to Jeremiah Blackwood, then 68, patriarch of a family that had progressively isolated itself from the community over decades. What started as simple social removal would eventually become one of the most disturbing stories of abuse, isolation, and intentional genetic manipulation ever documented. The initial investigation showed that 4 of the 7 women were biological daughters of Jeremiah, while the other 3 were the result of unions between his own children and daughters over the years. The coefficient of consanguinity for some of them, as later calculated by geneticists at the University of Washington, reached values close to 0.375, numbers rarely seen outside extremely isolated communities. "This was not a case of ignorance or accident," explained Dr. Eliza Montgomery, the forensic geneticist in charge of the case. "We found detailed diaries that demonstrate clearly a deliberate intention to create a pure lineage, as they called it. There were notes on specific physical characteristics, attempts to select traits like eye color and bone structure through planned crossings between close relatives." The Blackwood case not only shocked the small local community, but also rekindled discussions on rural isolation, community surveillance, and the limits of family privacy in remote regions of the United States. Blackwood family history goes back to the Great Depression when Elijah Blackwood, Jeremiah's grandfather, acquired the 200-acre property in 1931 for a fraction of its value. Original Lane County records show that Elijah, a former miner who lost everything in the economic collapse, paid only $175 for the land, a value that even in that epoch was considered extremely low. The reason for the price, according to local historical archives, was that the property had a sinister reputation. In 1924, former owner John Wickman had murdered his entire family before committing suicide. And since then, no one had been interested in the land. This event, although apparently disconnected from the history of the Blackwoods, would establish a pattern of isolation and superstition that would shape the family's fate. Elijah Blackwood arrived with his wife Martha and 5 children, 3 boys and 2 girls. According to the few school records preserved in the Municipal Library of Oak Ridge, the children attended the local school for just a year before they were removed for home education. The official document of school dismissal, dated 1933, contains an observation from the director of the time: "Family demonstrates extreme, not innate, behavior. Children exhibit proper knowledge for age but avoid contact with other students." The family rarely went to the city, making only 2 or 3 annual visits to buy what they could not produce. A diary maintained by the local warehouse owner between 1935 and 1940, preserved at the Oak Ridge Historical Museum, records, "The Blackwoods came today. As always, the children and Mrs. B stayed in the car while the old man made the shopping. No one smiles in that family. Bought unusual amounts of kerosene and ammunition. Something doesn't seem right with them." During World War II, when recruitment agents visited the property in 1943, they found armed resistance. The police records of the time indicate that Elijah threatened the officers with a shotgun, stating that no Blackwood would spill blood for a government that only remembers men when it needs them to die. For some reason not fully clarified in the archives, the authorities decided not to insist. It was in this context of paranoia and isolation that Harold Blackwood, the middle son of Elijah and father of Jeremiah, grew. Documents found on the property during the 1997 investigation reveal that Harold married his own second cousin, Rebecca, who lived in Idaho. The wedding was registered in Boise in 1952, but Rebecca was never seen by the Oak Ridge community. Harold appeared one day with a wife, recalled Eleanor Wilson, then 93 years old, a former local male employee, in her testimony. "We never really saw her, right? She was in the car, always wearing a wide flap hat and veil, even in summer. The letters that came to her from Idaho stopped arriving after a couple of years." Medical records recovered from the property indicate that Rebecca gave birth to 6 children between 1953 and 1962, all at home, without professional medical assistance. Of these, only 3 survived beyond childhood: Jeremiah, born in 1956, Mary, in 1958, and Joseph, in 1961. The other 3 babies died of congenital complications, according to notes made by Harold in a notebook that served as an improvised family medical record. A disturbing entry in this notebook, dated 1962, suggests the moment when the ideology of genetic isolation began to take more concrete form: "Rebecca is too weak for more children. But we don't need strangers. We have our own pure blood, strong like steel when kept without mixtures. The weak die so that the strong prosper." This is the law of nature that the men of the city forgot. When Harold died in 1978, victim of a tractor accident, Jeremiah, then 22 years old, took control of the property and family. At that time, according to tax records, the family had expanded the main house and built 2 additional structures on the property, one being the barn that would become the center of the horror discovered almost 2 decades later. The family's isolation intensified under Jeremiah's leadership. While his father still maintained minimal contact with the city for essential purchases, Jeremiah reduced these interactions practically to zero. Agricultural supply store records show that the last purchase made by a Blackwood occurred in 1983, when Jeremiah acquired large amounts of seeds, tools, and construction materials, sufficient to support a long period of complete isolation. Most disturbing, as revealed by the diary seized in 1997, was the transition from simple social isolation to a deliberate project of genetic purification. Jeremiah, who apparently developed a self-taught interest in genetics through books found on the property, began to systematically document family physical characteristics and plan unions between relatives. "The outside world corrupts the blood," he wrote in an entry from 1985. "Each generation that remains pure strengthens what we are. The weak will die, the strong will prosper. In 5 generations, we will have created something that the world has never seen." The Red Barn, built in 1980 according to records found on the property, was projected from the beginning not as an agricultural structure, but as a lockdown space. Detailed hand-drawn plans by Jeremiah show a 2-story building with internal partitions, a rudimentary water system, and, more disturbingly, an elaborate system of locks that could only be opened from the outside. The 7 women rescued in 1997 lived in conditions that police reports described as medieval. The ground floor of the barn contained a common central area with a long wooden table, some rustic benches, and a wood stove that provided minimal heating during the rigorous Oregon winters. The second floor had been divided into small cubicles that functioned as individual dormitories, each with a straw mattress and a bucket for physiological needs. There was no electricity. There was no proper plumbing, said the report from social services. Water was supplied through a gutter system that collected rainwater in barrels. During periods of drought, apparently Jeremiah or his brother Joseph brought water from a nearby well. The barn windows had been nailed and covered with boards, allowing only light to enter through small cracks and some translucent tiles on the roof. This, according to the psychologists who evaluated the victims, was a calculated form of temporal disorientation. The women had only a vague notion of the passage of days, depending on the natural light that could penetrate these limited openings. The case became even more disturbing when Sarah, the oldest of the women rescued, then 42, started talking to the investigators. Sarah was identified as Jeremiah's biological daughter with his own sister, Mary. She had been the first to be confined to the barn at the age of 15. "Daddy said we were special, that our blood was purer than that of any family in America," said Sarah in a recorded statement now preserved in the FBI archives as part of its extreme case study program. "He had horse breeding books on how breeders maintain pure strains. He said that we were doing the same thing, only better." If you also feel the weight of this story, comment now. Purity does not justify the cruelty. According to the diaries and the testimony of Sarah, the system worked in a methodical way. Women, as soon as they reached puberty, were transferred to the barn. There they were visited regularly by Jeremiah or Joseph in a system of rotation documented in notebooks found in the main house. These visits resulted in frequent pregnancies, although many ended in miscarriages or stillbirths. Weak babies did not survive, and this was considered natural, even desirable, explained Dr. Robert Peterson, the forensic psychiatrist designated for the case. The male children who survived were eventually taken to the main house to be trained, while the girls remained in the barn with their mothers, perpetuating the cycle. The daily routine of the women, as reconstructed by the investigators, consisted mainly of work, sewing, preparing simple foods, cleaning the confined space, and cultivating a small adjacent garden beside the barn, where they could spend brief periods, always watched. This garden, ironically, was the only source of beauty in their lives. Several flower species had been planted among the vegetables, creating a surreal contrast with the darkness of their existence. Makeshift medical records kept by Jeremiah, found during the investigation, revealed a disturbing clinical coldness. Each woman had a chart detailing her physical characteristics, pregnancy history, and, more disturbingly, her reproductive value classified on a scale of 1 to 10. The food provided to the women was surprisingly nutritious, though monotonous, mainly vegetables cultivated on the property, eggs, milk, and occasionally meat. This was not a typical case of nutritional deprivation, said nutritionist Elizabeth Dawson in her report. On the contrary, there was an almost obsessive concern with certain nutrients. "We found homemade supplements based on herbs, apparently formulated to strengthen the blood as described in Jeremiah's notebooks. Communication with the outside world was non-existent. The women did not have access to radios, newspapers, or any other source of information. Their knowledge was limited to what they learned from each other and the few books allowed in the barn, mainly practical manuals on agriculture, home medicine, and, disturbingly, an altered Bible from which Jeremiah had removed several passages and added his own texts. One of the most unsettling discoveries was Emma's notebooks, the second oldest of the women, then 37 years old. Hidden under her mattress, they contained detailed drawings of what she imagined to be the outside world, based only on stories told by the older women and the scarce images in the few books available. Her designs of modern cities resembled illustrations from the 19th century, revealing the profound informational isolation in which they lived. They developed their own communication system, explained Dr. Linda Morris, a linguist who analyzed interactions between the women after the rescue. It wasn't exactly a new language, but they used common words with specific meanings that only they understood. For example, they called the sun the vigilante and had dozens of different terms to describe the sounds of the barn during storms. When asked about resistance or escape attempts, the women showed a conditioned response of fear. "Where would we go?" asked Lily, then 23 years old, during a therapy session. "Daddy said that the outside world was full of radiation, that people were sick and deformed. He said we were the only healthy people, and that one day when it was safe, we would leave and repopulate the earth." This apocalyptic mythology, created by Jeremiah to justify the isolation, had been elaborated over decades and incorporated real news elements that he distorted, references to the Chernobyl nuclear accident, the AIDS epidemic, and other global events that he presented as signs of the imminent collapse of civilization. When the 7 women were finally examined at the University of Oregon Medical Center, doctors documented the physical consequences of generations of endogamy. The medical report, later published in the American Journal of Medical Genetics as an anonymous case study, detailed a series of conditions rarely seen in such concentration. The pattern of observed anomalies suggests severe consanguinity sustained over multiple generations, wrote Dr. James Richardson, the main geneticist of the study. We are observing the expression of several rare recessive genes that normally would remain dormant in populations with greater genetic diversity. Among the most evident conditions were polydactyly, extra fingers on the hands or feet, present in 5 of the 7 women, severe dental malformations including oligodontia, congenital absence of multiple teeth, and microdontia, abnormally small teeth. 4 of the women had heterochromia, a condition where each eye has a different color, a feature that Jeremiah apparently valued and was trying to select according to his diaries. More worrying were the internal conditions. Imaging exams revealed heart malformations in all the women, ranging from light septal defects to more serious conditions such as tetralogy of Fallot, present in 2 of them. The most serious case was that of Rose, 19, said the medical report. She presented a combination of conditions we would rarely see together in a single patient: craniosynnosis, premature fusion of skull bones resulting in severe facial deformity, achondroplasia, a form of dwarfism, and severe immunological deficiency that made her extremely vulnerable to infections. It is remarkable that she has survived to this age without medical intervention. One of the younger women, April, then 14, had a rare metabolic disorder known as phenylketonuria, which had not been treated properly, resulting in irreversible neurological damage. The cognitive and psychological impact was equally deep. Neuropsychological tests revealed that 5 of the 7 women had some degree of intellectual disability, although it was difficult to determine how much of this was the result of genetic factors and how much owed to extreme educational and sensory deprivation. Sarah's case is particularly interesting, said Dr. Patricia Winters, a neuropsychologist. Despite conditions of extreme isolation, she demonstrates above-average cognitive capacity. She learned to read alone, teaching herself through the few available books, and later taught the others. She developed a complex time-counting system based on light patterns that entered through cracks in the roof. DNA tests performed with state-of-the-art technology at the time confirmed what the physical symptoms already suggested. The endogamy coefficient of some of the younger women reached levels rarely seen in modern medical literature. In simple terms, the DNA of these women contains long identical segments on both chromosomes, something that only occurs when the same genes are inherited from both parents who, in turn, share very close common ancestors, explained Dr. Richardson in an interview with Scientific American in 1999. In normal populations, we see small segments like this reflecting a distant common ancestry. But in this case, up to 37% of the genome of some of the younger women consisted of these identical segments, numbers we would only find in extreme cases of population isolation. Perhaps the most disturbing discovery was the documentation found in the main house. In a locked office, the investigators found dozens of notebooks where Jeremiah had meticulously documented his observations over decades. These notebooks revealed that the patriarch was aware of the genetic risks but saw them as a necessary process of purification. The first generations will suffer so that the future can transcend, he wrote in an entry dated 1992. The ancient Egyptians understood this. The pharaohs married their sisters for divine reasons, not worldly. The weak are naturally eliminated. The strong survive and strengthen themselves. In another 10 generations, we will have created a superior lineage. This distortion of basic scientific knowledge to justify extreme abuse reflected a toxic combination of isolation, paranoia, and pathological narcissism. Jeremiah had built an elaborate belief system that combined poorly interpreted elements of genetics, decontextualized religious references, and conspiracy theories on racial purity and the genetic degeneration of modern society. Among the books found on the property were texts on eugenics from the early 20th century, treatises on animal breeding, and, surprisingly, several recent academic books on population genetics, suggesting that Jeremiah occasionally obtained updated materials, possibly through correspondence requests. "He was not a man without education," said Dr. Peterson in his psychological assessment. "He demonstrated considerable intelligence, but it was severely distorted by isolation, possible untreated mental illness, and selective exposure to information that reinforced his pre-existing beliefs. It is a classic case of how knowledge without adequate social context or ethical supervision can be dangerously misapplied." The morning of October 21, 1997, marked the beginning of a new life for the 7 Blackwood Barn women. After 4 days of preliminary medical evaluations, they were transferred to a specialized facility in Portland, where a multidisciplinary team of doctors, psychologists, social workers, and special educators began what would be one of the most complex rehabilitation processes ever documented in the United States. The fate of Jeremiah and Joseph Blackwood followed its parallel course. Both were arrested on the day of the barn's discovery and, after extensive psychiatric evaluations, were considered able to answer for their crimes. In September 1998, after a trial that lasted 3 weeks and attracted national attention, Jeremiah was sentenced to 6 consecutive life imprisonment terms with no possibility of parole on multiple charges of kidnapping, rape, incest, and child abuse. Joseph, whom prosecutors argued had acted under the psychological coercion of his older brother, received a 45-year sentence. "This is not just a case of extreme abuse," said Judge Eleanor Hayes during sentencing. "It is a case of deliberate and systematic perversion of fundamental principles of humanity, extending for decades and affecting multiple generations. The court rarely finds circumstances where the social reintegration of a defendant is considered fundamentally impossible, but this is one of those cases." Jeremiah remained impassive throughout the trial, refusing to recognize the legitimacy of the court. His only statement, made during the sentencing phase, revealed the depth of his distorted conviction: "You do not understand what you destroyed. It was not a prison. It was a sanctuary. It was not cruelty. It was directed evolution. In 100 years, when your lineages are weak and sick, the world will regret what was lost here." Joseph, on the other hand, progressively demonstrated signs of understanding the gravity of his acts. In a letter sent to the court before sentencing, he wrote, "I grew up believing the world was as Jeremiah said. I never knew another reality. That does not justify what I did, but perhaps it explains how a human being can become an accomplice to something so horrible without fully recognizing its horror." For the 7 women, the process of reintegration would be long and complex. The special program developed for them by the University of Oregon, later known as the Blackwood Protocol, became a model for extreme cases involving victims of prolonged isolation. "We couldn't simply launch them into the modern world," explained Dr. Catherine Morris, the program coordinator. "Everything, from the constant noise of a city to basic concepts such as electricity, television, or the internet, was completely alien to them. We had to create a transition environment where they could be gradually exposed to aspects of modern life, always with intensive psychological support." The case gained a new dimension when, in 2001, Sarah Blackwood, the oldest of the rescued women, published her memoirs with the help of Dr. Morris. The book Born in Darkness, Memories of the Blackwood Barn became an instantaneous bestseller and was later adapted into an award-winning HBO documentary. The yields were placed in a fiduciary fund to support the continuous treatment and education of all survivors. "We are not just victims," Sarah wrote in the epilogue of her book. "We are survivors, and now, finally, we are people entitled to our own futures. The story of the barn is over, but our individual stories are just beginning." The impact of the Blackwood case extended far beyond the fate of the people directly involved. In 2003, the United States Congress approved the SARA law, establishing new protocols for monitoring children in home education in isolated rural areas. The law also created special funds for training professionals in rural communities to identify signs of extreme family abuse. In the scientific community, the anonymous medical data collected from the Blackwood women, always with their informed consent, contributed significantly to the understanding of the effects of severe consanguinity on humans. A longitudinal study still in progress at the University of Washington continues to monitor the genetic, medical, and psychological aspects of the case, generating dozens of scientific publications that have helped improve treatments for various rare genetic conditions. In 2015, 18 years after the rescue, the Blackwood property was finally demolished after being acquired by the state of Oregon. Where the barn once stood, a small memorial was established, a simple bronze plate with the words, "To honor the resilience of the human spirit in the face of extreme cruelty." To remember that isolation should never replace community surveillance. Of the 7 women rescued, 5 eventually managed to establish independent lives, although with varying degrees of need for continuous support. Rose and April, the most severely affected by genetic conditions, remained under specialized care. Sarah, the oldest, became a respected activist for the rights of abuse victims and a symbol of resilience. In her speech at the National Conference on Child Abuse in 2010, she offered a powerful perspective. "People often ask me how I survived those years in the barn. The truth is that I survived because I never knew there was an alternative. Now I know there was a whole world beyond those walls. My mission is to ensure that no child ever grows up without knowing that he is entitled to this world." The legacy of the Blackwood case remains a dark reminder of the extremes of human isolation and the abuse that can occur when communities lose contact with their most isolated members. It also serves as a testimony to the extraordinary human capacity for recovery and adaptation, even after experiences that challenge the limits of understanding.